The old warrior stood up, shaky, blood trickling from 100 small cuts on his arms, chest heaving as he blew a sharp note through a bone whistle. For almost 2 days, Sitting Bull danced in the scorching sun, tied to a pole, no food, no water, just a vision locked in his head. June 1876, and he saw it plain as daylight. Bluecoats dropping into his camp like grasshoppers, 700 of them, dead on arrival. They have no ears, a voice boomed in his mind. 8 days later, George Custer and his 7th Cavalry rolled into the Little Bighorn Valley. 286 didn't make it out. This wasn't just a fight. It was a reckoning, a brief win that stunned a nation throwing its 100th birthday party. Here's the twist. Sitting Bull didn't lift a weapon that day. So how did this holy man, this rebel chief, turn a vision into the biggest Indian victory against the United States? And why, after smashing Custer, did it all fall apart? Stick around. You won't believe how this ends. Late 1875. President Ulysses S. Grant lays down the law. After January 1, 1876, any Plains Indians not on reservations get labeled enemy combatants. The Army's coming for them. No exceptions. This isn't a snap decision. It's been building for years, driven by fights over land and a scramble for resources. Back in 1874, George Armstrong Custer took a team into the Black Hills and hit the jackpot. Gold. Trouble is, those hills belonged to the Lakota, promised to them outright by the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty. The U.S. swore to keep settlers out, to let the Lakota keep their way of life. But gold changes everything. To the Lakota, the Black Hills aren't just a patch of ground. They're sacred, the core of their spiritual world, where their beliefs take root. They're also practical, the best spot left to hunt buffalo, to feed their people without relying on government handouts. So when Custer's expedition leaked word of gold, miners swarmed in. By 1875, around 800 prospectors were digging, with more showing up every week. The treaty said no trespassers, but the government looked the other way. Too weak to stop it, too afraid of the backlash from voters chasing wealth. The Lakota saw their land trampled, and Washington just let it happen. Grant tried to fix it, sort of. He spent years sending agents to buy the Black Hills from the Lakota. $6 million was on the table once, a huge sum in those days. The Lakota wouldn't bite. Selling wasn't even a concept to them. The hills were holy, untouchable, and their last chance to stay independent. The earth doesn't belong to us. We belong to it, one leader told the negotiators. Grant's men kept at it, dangling cash, promising supplies. But the Lakota knew better. Government promises were shaky, and they'd rather hunt than depend on crumbs from Indian agents. Then the economy crashed. In 1873, a financial panic gutted the U.S. banks, shut down, railroads stalled, and the government went broke. Unemployment spiked to 14%. Millions were jobless, and cities were desperate. That Black Hills gold turned into a national obsession. Historians say it could have flooded the market, propped up the dollar, pulled the country out of the hole. Grant's team saw dollar signs, but the Lakota stood in the way. Miners kept pouring in, and the government had to pick, honor the treaty and lose the gold, or scrap the treaty and take it. They chose the easy road. The tension was thick. Americans viewed the plains as a problem, untamed land, untamed people, blocking the march of progress. Newspapers stirred the pot, calling the tribes obstacles, hyping the West as a prize. Politicians saw votes in pushing forward, and the Army was ready to roll. Grant's deadline wasn't a suggestion, it was a threat. Get to the reservations, or face the consequences. The Lakota, Cheyenne, and others out there following the buffalo, living free, weren't just ignoring an order. They were up against a machine that wanted them gone. 2 years back, the U.S. had 33,000 troops on standby. By 1876, they'd mobilize for a real war. Custer was gearing up for another run. cavalry at his side. The pieces were in place, and time was running out. Gold lust, busted promises, and a cash-strapped government. It was all heading for a collision. Could the Lakota push back? By 1875, Sitting Bull had made up his mind. No treaties, no reservations, no playing nice with the U.S. He wasn't giving an inch. Red Cloud took a different road. After signing the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty, he settled into reservation life, trying to keep the peace as settlers edged closer every year. He'd fought the Army hard in the 1860s, forced them to abandon the Bozeman Trail. But now he was working within the lines, adjusting to the new reality. Sitting Bull saw that as giving up. For him, it was freedom on the plains or bust. People started talking about him, his name carrying more weight with every passing season. The years from 1866 to 1874 are fuzzy. Not much got written down about Sitting Bull then, just bits from Lakota oral histories and some stiff U.S. government notes. Still, he wasn't idle. During Red Cloud's war against the Army, he lingered on the fringes, not leading the charge, but making his mark. Folks began to notice him, not just as a fighter, but as a spiritual figure, someone who could pull people together. By the mid-1870s, he'd stepped up as a resistance leader, especially as the Black Hills mess heated up. He didn't need a megaphone. His actions spoke loud enough. Reservation life wasn't a clean split for the Plains tribes. Some worked the system, stay put in winter when food ran low, then head out to hunt buffalo in summer. They'd grab government supplies when they could, but kept their old ways alive. Others trusted the agencies full-time. That didn't go well. Food deliveries, flour, beef, whatever, often showed up late, or not at all. In 1874, a Cheyenne group near the Red Cloud Agency went 3 months with nothing. Families went hungry, some didn't make it, and the agents didn't blink. Sitting Bull called it early. He told anyone listening that relying on the government was a trap. Step out of line, keep your traditions too loud, and they'd cut off your rations. He nailed it. Agents wielded food like a club to keep everyone quiet. Young guys took it hardest. In Lakota and Cheyenne camps, you proved yourself by hunting or fighting. Take down a buffalo, hit a rival camp. That's how you got respect, built a name. Reservations stopped all that cold. No more raids, no more big hunts. You just sat there, waiting for handouts. A 20-year-old warrior stuck doing nothing? That stung deep. Then the government piled on. Sell the Black Hills, they demanded, or get shipped to Indian Territory, Oklahoma today. A flat stretch miles from anything they knew. The Lakota said no way. Losing the hills meant losing their lifeline, their shot at staying free. Starvation loomed, trust in the system evaporated, and people started moving. Sitting Bull's camp became the spot. Out along the Powder River, it turned into a magnet. Lakota showed up. Hunters fed up with broken promises. Families sick of empty bellies. Cheyenne rolled in too. Groups done with agency nonsense. By late 1875, it was packed, thousands strong. Hunk Papa Lakota mixing with Oglala and Cheyenne. He didn't turn anyone away, handing out buffalo meat and robes to keep them going. His plan was straightforward. Ignore Grant's deadline. Keep hunting, keep roaming, steer clear of white folks. If the army came, he'd fight to protect his people, nothing more. It wasn't fancy, but it worked. People didn't just come for shelter. They came because he stood firm when everything else was crumbling. It wasn't just a camp anymore. It was a coalition. Some said he ran all the Sioux, but that's not true. He was Hunk Papa Lakota, one chief among many. Still, he pulled in crowds like nobody else, Lakota and Cheyenne alike. He offered something solid, a flat refusal to bow. By winter 1875, with Grant's cutoff nearing, his camp was swelling. Refugees, fighters, anyone who'd had enough, they all bet on him. Could he hold it together against what was coming? January 1, 1876, came and went. Grant's deadline passed, And the U.S. Army didn't waste time. They kicked off a three-pronged attack, hitting the Powder River and Little Bighorn regions hard. This wasn't a skirmish. It was the opening salvo of the Great Sioux War of 1876, a full-on campaign to smash any tribe still dodging reservations. General Philip Sheridan ran the show, splitting his forces into columns under Generals Crook, Terry, and Gibbon. Their target, the Lakota, Cheyenne, and anyone else who wouldn't toe the line. By March, they were moving, aiming to sweep up every non-compliant camp in their path. The Army meant business, 33,000 troops nationwide, with thousands funneled into this fight. They weren't alone. The Crow and Shoshone signed up with the U.S., eager to settle old scores. Back in the 1850s, the Lakota and Cheyenne had pushed them off prime hunting grounds in the Powder River country. The 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty locked those lands in for the Lakota, but the Crow and Shoshone never forgot. Now, with the Army's muscle behind them, they saw a chance to take it back. A Crow scout later said they joined to drive the Sioux from our father's lands. Rivalries ran deep, and the U.S. was happy to use them. By spring, dozens of Crow and Shoshone scouts were riding alongside federal troops, guiding them through the hills. The Army switched up their playbook. Instead of summer raids, they struck in winter. March 17, 1876, Colonel Reynolds hit a Cheyenne village on the Powder River. It was brutal, tents burned, horses scattered, families fleeing into the snow. The idea was simple: catch the tribes when they were hunkered down, least expecting it. Survivors didn't have many options. Hundreds stumbled through the cold, half-starved, heading for Sitting Bull's camp. He was ready. His scouts spotted them coming, and he sent warriors out with buffalo meat and robes. One account says he greeted them himself, telling them, "You are welcome here. We stand together." By April, his camp was bursting, 10,000 people, 2,500 warriors strong. Some reckon it was the biggest gathering of Plains tribes ever, a sprawling sea of teepees stretching along the river. Sitting Bull didn't stop there. He needed more fighters. He sent runners to the reservations, guys like Black Moon and Gall, with a clear message: ditch the agencies, join the fight. Plenty listened. Young men, sick of rotting on handouts, slipped away from places like the Red Cloud Agency. One report pegged 200 warriors leaving in a single month. The camp's numbers climbed daily, a mix of Hunkpapa Lakota, Oglala, Cheyenne, even some Arapaho trickling in. Sitting Bull wasn't just a chief now. He was a protector, a rallying point for everyone fed up with the U.S. squeeze. He knew muscle alone wouldn't cut it. Early June, he called for a Sundance. This wasn't a party. It was a gut-wrenching ritual to tap into the Great Spirit's power. His adopted brother, Jumping Bear, stepped up to help. They started with the offering: 100 tiny chunks of flesh, each the size of a pinhead, sliced from Sitting Bull's arms. Blood ran down his skin as he worked, no flinching. Then came the main event. They pierced his chest with leather strips, tying him to the center pole of the lodge. He stood there, bleeding, no food, no water, staring straight at the sun. For nearly 2 days, he danced, blowing a bone whistle, feet pounding the dirt. The heat baked him, his vision blurred, but he kept going. Around hour 40, it hit him, a vision. He saw Bluecoats, U.S. soldiers, tumbling into his camp upside down, like grasshoppers dropping from the sky. A voice rang out: "They have no ears." They wouldn't listen, wouldn't stop, and they'd fall. When he collapsed, his people carried him out. He came to and told them what he'd seen. A big win over the Army was coming. The camp buzzed. Warriors sharpened their spears, women stitched extra moccasins. Kids ran around wide-eyed. Sitting Bull didn't promise easy times, just a fight they could win. By mid-June, his camp was a fortress, 2,500 fighters ready to roll. The Army was closing in, 3 columns tightening the net. Could his vision hold up? The answer was days away. June 17, 1876, dawned quiet along Rosebud Creek. Then Crazy Horse struck. He led 1,000 warriors, mostly Oglala Lakota and Cheyenne, straight at General George Crook's column. 1,300 soldiers and scouts marching north to link up with the Army's bigger push. Crazy Horse aimed to catch them napping, hit hard, and scatter them before they could dig in. It almost worked. His fighters swarmed in at sunrise, whooping and firing, hoping to break Crook's line fast. But the Army's Crow and Shoshone scouts were sharp. They spotted dust kicking up miles out and sounded the alarm. Surprise gone, Crazy Horse had to slug it out. The fight stretched 6 hours, a brutal back and forth across the creek's banks. Crook's men unloaded 25,000 rounds, rifles popping nonstop, while Crazy Horse's warriors darted in and out, striking, then fading into the hills. One Lakota later called it a fight like wolves snapping at a herd. The Army held, barely, but Crook pulled back south. His column stalled. The Lakota and Cheyenne named it the battle, where the girl saved her brother after a Cheyenne woman rode out to rescue her wounded brother under fire. It wasn't a knockout, but it stopped one of the Army's 3 prongs cold. 8 days later, June 25, 1876, the real storm hit. George Armstrong Custer and 700 men from the 7th Cavalry rolled toward the Little Bighorn River, or Greasy Grass, as the Lakota called it. Sitting Bull's Unity Camp sprawled along its banks, a massive hub of 10,000 people. Teepees lined up for miles. Custer figured he'd found a soft target. Scouts had warned him the camp was huge, maybe 2,000 warriors strong, but he brushed it off. He split his force into 3, 210 with him, the rest under Reno and Benteen, planning to hit from multiple angles. Bad call. The camp wasn't sleeping. Warriors grabbed weapons, women and kids scattered, and the fight kicked off fast. Sitting Bull, pushing 45 and an elder chief, didn't ride out. His days of frontline scrapping were behind him. Instead, he bolted to the tents, yelling for the women and children to get out. Dust and smoke choked the air as he herded them toward the hills, keeping them clear of the chaos. He spotted his nephew, White Bull, gearing up. White Bull had an old musket, not much use in a close scrap. Sitting Bull grabbed his own shield, the one his father had handed down, painted with his spirit markings, and shoved it into White Bull's hands. "Take this, you'll need it more," he said. Then he tossed him a stone club, perfect for smashing in tight quarters. "Drop that gun. This is better," he told him. White Bull nodded and ran off to join the fray. Sitting Bull stayed back, his job done for now. His Sundance vision had set the stage. The warriors would handle the rest. Crazy Horse took charge. With 2,000 fighters, Lakota, Cheyenne, a few Arapaho, he faced Custer's scattered 700. Reno's group hit the camp's south end first, charging in around 3 p.m. They met a wall of resistance, took heavy losses, and retreated across the river, pinned down in the bluffs. Custer, meanwhile, swung north, aiming to cut off the camp's escape. He misjudged bad. Crazy Horse and Gull rallied their men, splitting them to trap Custer's 210 on a ridge later dubbed Last Stand Hill. By 4 p.m., it was mayhem, arrows flying, guns barking, horses screaming. Warriors swarmed up the slopes, cutting through Custer's lines. One Cheyenne account said Crazy Horse rode straight into the thick of it, shouting, "It's a good day to fight." In 2 hours, it was over. 5 of Custer's 12 companies, 286 men, lay dead, Custer included, sprawled among his troopers. The rest of the 7th Cavalry, under Reno and Benteen, holed up miles away, battered but alive. It was a wipeout, the biggest win any tribe ever scored against the U.S. Army. Sitting Bull's camp erupted, warriors cheered, women sang victory songs. Crazy Horse had turned the tide, but Sitting Bull's vision had lit the fuse. The Bluecoats fell, just like he'd seen. Still, the old chief stayed quiet amid the noise. He'd warned them not to loot or scalp, but some couldn't resist. That shadow would linger. For now, though, the greasy grass ran red, and the Plains tribes stood tall. How long could it last? The dust settled at Little Bighorn, and Sitting Bull's vision had come true. Bluecoats littered the ground, 286 of them dead, but he'd seen more in that Sundance trance. He'd told his warriors not to touch the bodies. No scalping, no looting. Let them lie, he said, a warning tied to the Great Spirit's promise of victory. The fighters didn't listen. After the last shot echoed, some grabbed knives and hatchets. Scalps got taken, rifles and coats stripped from the corpses. One Cheyenne later bragged about snagging Custer's boots. Sitting Bull watched it unfold, his face tight. To him, this wasn't just disrespect. It risked breaking the vision's power. The triumph felt heavy, muddied by what followed. He stayed quiet as the camp roared with celebration, but that shadow stuck with him. Word of the massacre hit Washington on July 3, 1876, right as the U.S. geared up for its 100th Independence Day bash. Philadelphia was decked out, flags waving, bands tuning up for the big centennial. Then the telegram landed. Custer and his men wiped out by savages on some river out west. The party soured fast. Newspapers splashed it everywhere. New York Times called it a national calamity. Custer wasn't just any officer. He'd made his name in the Civil War, a flashy hero with a knack for headlines. Now he was dead, and the public flipped. Politicians demanded blood. Citizens wrote letters begging for the army to teach those Indians a lesson. By July 5, Congress was already talking revenge, and the mood shifted from fireworks to war drums. Back at the greasy grass, Sitting Bull's camp partied hard. For a month, they feasted, buffalo roasting, victory dances every night. Warriors swapped stories of the fight. Kids ran around mimicking Crazy Horse's charge. But it didn't last. By August, the unity started cracking. Some headed back to the reservations, figuring the win bought them breathing room. Maybe 1,000 trickled out over a few weeks, drawn by promises of food or just worn down. They got a rude wake-up. The army was waiting. Troops flooded the agencies, rifles ready. Every man stepping in got disarmed, weapons confiscated on the spot. One report from the Red Cloud Agency said 300 guns got seized in a single sweep. Then the rations tightened. Agents cut supplies at the slightest whiff of trouble. Miss a roll call, talk too loud, and your family went hungry. It was control by starvation, and it worked. Congress piled on. August 15, 1876, they rammed through an amendment to the Indian Appropriations Act. The deal: hand over the Black Hills, or no more government aid. No cash, no food, nothing. The Lakota had no leverage. 10,000 people can't eat grass. A commission rolled into the agencies, papers in hand, and strong-armed chiefs into signing. By September, the hills were gone, legally snatched for $25,000 a year, pennies for sacred land. The unity camp thinned out more. Even Crazy Horse, the fiercest holdout, saw the writing on the wall. May 6, 1877. He rode into Fort Robinson with 900 followers, half-starved and out of options. 4 months later, he was dead, bayoneted in a scuffle after bolting from custody. Word spread he'd tried to escape when rumors swirled about shipping him east. His surrender didn't save him. Sitting Bull wouldn't break. July 19, 1877. He took his band, about 1,000 Hunkpapa Lakota, and crossed into Canada. They hit Saskatchewan, settling near Wood Mountain, out of the Army's reach. For 3 years, he dodged U.S. pressure. Officials sent messengers begging him to come back, promising amnesty. He told them to shove it. "I'd rather die here than live on your terms," he said once, per a Canadian trader's account. But Canada wasn't paradise. Buffalo herds shrank, winters bit harder, and locals grumbled about feeding American Indians. By 1881, his people were starving. down to eating horses. July 19, 1881, he crossed back, surrendering at Fort Buford with 187 followers, gaunt and done. He didn't stay down. In 1885, Buffalo Bill Cody came knocking. Sitting Bull signed up for the Wild West show, swapping his war bonnet for a paycheck. He rode out in arenas, stared down crowds in Chicago and New York, a living legend on display. It wasn't the plains, but it was survival. The victory at Little Bighorn faded, replaced by a new grind. How'd he go from chief to showman? Sitting Bull and Red Cloud walked different roads. Red Cloud signed the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty and spent his later years working the reservation system, cutting deals to keep his people alive as settlers swallowed the plains. He'd fought hard once, shut down the Bozeman Trail in the 1860s, but by the 1870s, he was playing it practical, bending to survive. Sitting Bull didn't bend. He rejected every treaty, every offer, every inch of compromise. No reservations, no handouts, just the open plains or nothing. He stuck to that until the end, even when the odds stacked sky high against him. Their paths split the Lakota story in two, one chief adapting to a shrinking world, the other fighting to keep it wide open. People got it wrong sometimes, saying Sitting Bull ran all the Sioux. Not true. He was Hunkpapa Lakota, one band among many, Oglala, Minneconjou, Brule, and more. The Sioux weren't a monolith with a single king. They were a confederation, dozens of groups with their own leaders. Sitting Bull never claimed to rule them all. One U.S. report from 1876 called him Chief of all the Sioux, but that was lazy guesswork. His real strength wasn't a crown. It was pulling people together. By 1876, his camp swelled with Hunkpapa, Oglala, Cheyenne, even some Arapaho, all betting on his vision. He didn't command them like a general. He inspired them like a spark. At Little Bighorn, 2,500 warriors fought as one, not because he ordered it, but because he gave them a reason to stand up. That win, at Little Bighorn, was massive. June 25, 1876, Custer's 7th Cavalry got crushed. 286 dead. 5 companies gone in hours. No tribe had ever hit the U.S. that hard. Sitting Bull's vision and Crazy Horse's grit made it happen. A punch that echoed from the greasy grass to Washington. But it wasn't a happily ever after. The U.S. didn't shrug and walk away. They doubled down. By fall, cavalry flooded the Powder River country, 4,000 troops strong. Congress yanked the Black Hills away with that 1876 amendment, and the Army choked off supplies to the agencies. Little Bighorn bought the tribes a moment, not a future. Within a year, the plains were locked down tighter than ever, reservations turning into open-air cages. The victory lit a fire, but it also painted a target. Losing the Black Hills cut deeper than gold. Sure, the U.S. wanted the shiny stuff. By 1877, miners pulled $1 million worth out of Deadwood alone. But for the Lakota, those hills were life. They hunted there, prayed there, buried their stories in the soil. One elder called them the heart of everything that is. When Congress forced the sale, it didn't just take land, it ripped out a piece of the Lakota soul. Starvation followed fast. Without the hills buffalo, they leaned on agency rations that barely came. By 1880, some bands reported half their kids dying from hunger. The gold rush fattened Washington's pockets, but it starved the Lakota's spirit and body. Sitting Bull didn't quit, even when the walls closed in. After Little Bighorn, he dodged the army, taking 1,000 followers to Canada in 1877. For 3 years, he held out, telling U.S. envoys to get lost. "This is my country now," he told one in 1879. But the buffalo vanished, and Canada's patience wore thin. He surrendered in 1881, down to 187 gaunt survivors. Back in the U.S., he could have faded out, another broken chief. Instead, he joined Buffalo Bill's Wild West show in 1885. At 54, he rode into arenas, war bonnet on, staring down crowds from Boston to Street. Louis. He earned $50 a week. Solid cash then, plus extra selling photos. It wasn't war, but it was his way of staying in the game, adapting without bowing. His story sticks because it's raw. He faced a juggernaut. The US had 25 million people, endless guns, railroads snaking west. He had a few thousand, some horses, and a vision. Little Bighorn proved he could win, but the aftermath showed the cost. Exile, hunger, a circus tent instead of a teepee. It's not romantic, it's real. Courage got him through, faith kept him steady, but the empire he fought didn't flinch. Sitting Bull's legacy isn't a fairy tale. It's a gut check about standing tall when the ground's crumbling. Sitting Bull transformed early despair into the greatest Indian victory at Little Bighorn, uniting tribes with unbreakable determination, only to watch it collapse as the US overwhelmed them with force and starvation. That's the full tale of Sitting Bull and his fighting spirit. If you liked this or crave more Little Bighorn stories, comment and hit like to push us to make more videos like this. See you next time.